Honorable Chair, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, and representatives of civil society, it is an honor to address you as Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing. After assuming my functions in May this year, I am pleased to present my first thematic report to you. The report deals with a core issue touching us all, the COVID-19 pandemic and its impacts on the enjoyment of the right to adequate housing. The report is, however, also forward looking and tries to respond to the question of what states can actually do to build back better and ensure that the right to adequate housing is fulfilled and realized for all. Before presenting the report, let me thank all states, national human rights institutions, local governments, UN entities, civil society organizations, and scholars who responded to the joint call for inputs issued by 12 special rapporteurs of the United Nations. We received an unprecedented amount of information. Let me pay tribute to my predecessor, Leilani Farha, and her important work. Concluding her mandate with the guidelines for the implementation of the right to adequate housing, she was also quick to respond to the pandemic by calling for a global ban on evictions and publishing tailored guidance notes to protect vulnerable communities from the pandemic. Distinguished delegates, COVID 19 has fundamentally changed the meaning of having a home. Housing has emerged as a key defense against COVID 19, as governments have called on their citizens to stay at home, to work from home, or teach their children at home when schools are closed. At the peak of the COVID 19 emergency response, more than 3.9 billion people, or half of the world's population, were asked or ordered to stay at home by their governments. However, more than 1.8 billion people do not have a decent home and live in informal settlements where physical distancing is difficult or impossible. Many millions, especially renters and small landlords, are at risk of losing their home due to the economic impact of the pandemic. Too many people live in overcrowded homes in which it is hardly possible to self isolate. Millions lack adequate access to water and sanitation to follow hygiene recommendations. And many have no home at all and live in street situations or in encampments. How can they shelter at home that provides adequate protection against the virus, as we all ought to be able to do? It is clear that not having access to adequate housing is not just a housing issue in itself, but also a health issue, indeed, an issue of life or death during the pandemic. We can currently observe the following. First, the impact of COVID 19 on the right to housing has been very unequally distributed, reflecting pre existing hierarchies and inequalities along racial, gender, and other lines. Mortality and infection rates are significantly higher among minorities and other vulnerable groups with inadequate housing conditions, which have contributed to excessive, largely preventable death and suffering. Second, while the pandemic continues to rage, many temporary mitigation measures have either already come to an end or may soon do so. An unprecedented spike in evictions, hunger, homelessness, and eventually mortality is therefore to be expected. Third, forced evictions have continued, if not accelerated, during the pandemic. Persons who live in informal settlements, migrant workers, and other vulnerable groups, as well as populations at large, are now facing worsening conditions with heightened risk of infection, community spread of the virus, and mortality. I believe that these bleak outcomes can and should be avoided. A better approach to combating COVID 19 is available and possible. This is not only a question of tackling fiscal policy and legal constraints, but ultimately one of political vision and will. National, regional, local governments, housing providers, and civil society organizations can all play a key role to get us out of the current pandemic and housing crisis. Many states and local governments have indeed risen to the task during the pandemic. In many countries and cities, things were suddenly possible, which housing rights experts, civil society organizations, or social workers had asked for many years. For example, to provide water and sanitation facilities for informal settlements, to make a concerted effort to end street homelessness, and to prevent evictions through local, provincial, or national bans. Many states increased or established new social transfers to households to help them to cover rental, mortgage, and other costs for their survival. Some states prohibited any utility service cutoffs to prevent energy poverty and ensure continued access to safe water and sanitation. I fully commend these efforts. Several more positive examples are provided in my report. Many of these measures should be renewed and be in force until the end of the pandemic is in sight, starting with a global moratorium on evictions. Unfortunately, many of these positive measures are or have been of temporary nature and have either expired or will soon do so. Only if we transform such emergency responses into sustainable policies and strategies to realize the right to adequate housing as a way to build back better from the harm caused by the pandemic will we be able to address the fractures the pandemic has exposed in our societies. The right to housing should be a key element of any such response and recovery measures to the pandemic. This requires that sufficient resources are allocated towards realizing the right to adequate housing for all, and that national and local governments formulate a comprehensive human rights compliant housing strategies to ensure that no one is left behind. I also call upon states to halt all evictions proceedings during the pandemic, including against non national residents, and to end the sweeping of encampments or tents of homeless people. I urge states to house people experiencing homelessness in hotels, motels, or vacant housing and make plans to provide them with access to permanent housing. Nobody should be put back on the streets. States should consider rent caps and subsidies for tenants and small landlords and ensure that a global health crisis does not become a global housing crisis. States should constrain the role of private equity firms as landlords and improve the rights and protections of renters and tenants. Recovery measures should not be discriminatory and should leave no one behind. Where relevant, special measures must be put in place to guarantee that groups who have been subjected to systemic discrimination and marginalization benefit as a matter of priority from the response and recovery measures. In order to address issues effectively, data disaggregated by race, gender, caste, religion, disability, sexual orientation, or gender identity must be collected and shared publicly. Finally, low income countries face special challenges and should receive adequate development financing to ensure that they can recover from the global economic contraction caused by the pandemic, while they address grossly inadequate housing conditions for many people in their countries. Dear delegates, going back to the way things were cannot be a viable option. It would mean the resumption of mass evictions, turning a blind eye to homelessness, accepting precarious living of renters who face evictions and inadequate housing conditions, and discrimination in access to housing. In this crucial moment, we need to join forces and acknowledge that we all share responsibilities in realizing the right to adequate housing. Only together and with solidarity, we can make sure that no one is left behind. Thank you.